Welcome back to the third and final part of closing the gap between yield potential and achieved yield, a focus on peanut variety. In this final part, we're going to look at four specific varieties and the management that they need to help close the yield gap based on the specific characteristics that each variety has. And before we get to each variety, I wanted to point out the factors that we had talked about in section 2, part 2 of this talk. Just to refresh our memory that there were 12 factors. Rotation was a really important one, especially when it comes to disease control and nematode control. And we're looking now at specific varieties and their potential and how we can maximize their potential for closing the yield gap. Also wanted to remind you of something I said in the very first part, part 1, and that's that peanut varieties are not plug-and-play devices. They are biological organisms that each come with their own strengths and weaknesses, and we have to make sure we know what those strengths and weaknesses are. We can't just plug one variety into a scenario that works for a different variety, and that's a really important point to make. I think if you come away with nothing else, I want you to leave with this point, that varieties are different, and each variety must be managed to bolster its weaknesses and accentuate its strengths. And we don't want to take a new variety and plug it into an old production system that works well for the previous variety and expect that we're going to get the same sort of result. That is usually not going to happen. So I wanted to start out here with a variety that we all know well. The variety Georgia 06G has been around a long time. It's an outstanding variety, has done very well throughout our production systems in the southeast. But we know a lot about it, and because we know a lot about it, we know how to manage that variety. I just wanted to point out some of the things that are the weaknesses for that variety. One of them is germ. It tends to be a little weak on that, so we have a lot of growers planting more seed per foot of row to compensate for that. It also is weak on white mold, so we know that growers tend to put more effort into and more money into buying white mold products, not leaf spot products for this particular variety, because that tends to be its weakness. So what to do with this variety? Because of those weaknesses, obviously, control white mold. Those products that do a better job controlling white mold are used very heavily for this particular variety, and that is important for this variety, but it's not always the best thing to do for other varieties. It also has moderate sized vines, medium sized vines, so planting it in twin rows is a good practice for this particular variety, and it does very well in those twin rows. It can do well in single rows, but certainly responds to twin rows. I mentioned the germ rate is low many times, so planting more seed has been a common practice for this variety that we've learned over time to help compensate for those times when the seed don't come up as well as we'd like. Some growers also are improving vine growth with fertility and obviously with irrigation as well. If you have irrigation, that tends to promote vine growth as well, and that helps to improve yields and close the yield gap. So doing all four of these things, as well as others, really helps to close the yield gap between what we see in our variety tests and what we see in commercial settings. So what not to do is don't skimp on white mold control. Even though there's a 20 for leaf spot, I would say that historically white mold has been the most yield-robbing disease for Georgia 06G. So bolstering the fungicide program to control white mold has been important. And don't plant too early or too dry, because then you could run into germination problems and stand problems that would affect the final yield. So the bottom line for 06G, and I think all of you know this, is manage to minimize white mold, get a good plant stand, and if irrigated, control leaf spot well. Now let's look at a couple of new varieties, starting with Flowrun 331. You see here Flowrun 331 is a relatively new variety, and it's different than 06G in two major aspects. One, it has larger vines, much larger vines. We'll talk about why that's important. It also has a little more susceptibility to spotted wilt, but if you notice, it has less risk to white mold, and it has higher germ. Those are two positives compared to 06G. So we wouldn't want to just plug Flowrun 331 into the same system that we're growing 06G in, because it won't likely maximize its performance. And as we saw in some of the earlier data, it has excellent yield potential, but we want to grow it in a way that maximizes its yield potential, and that's not going to be the same scenario as you would be growing Georgia 06G. So what would we do with Flowrun 331 to maximize its yield potential? Well, because it has a little more susceptibility to spotted wilt, we want to make sure we use Thimet and plant at a later time of the year. And planting it in single rows because the large vines can be important, and you certainly don't want to plant too many seeds because in twin rows, if you are planting twin rows, you can wind up with a lot more vine than you want. I think also controlling the vines with the growth regulator apogee and less fertility than you might be using to grow O6G that has a smaller vine could help you achieve a higher yield with Flowrun 331. Now, what not to do: don't plant too early because of spotted wilt. Don't follow the practice of planting a lot of seeds like you would with O6G because it has good germ, and that's just going to promote more vine growth with this variety. And don't over fertilize and don't over water because that's going to promote vine growth as well. And especially in twin rows, don't overseed because you have good germ there, and it's going to promote more vine growth. So the bottom line for Flowrun 331 is to minimize tomato spotted wilt virus, to manage and control vine growth, and if irrigated, to control leaf spot well. And you'll notice I'm going to say that a lot because under irrigation, leaf spot tends to be one of the worst problems we can have, especially if it's the disease that is most problematic for that variety. Next, let's look at Tough Runner 297, another relatively new variety. It has large vines, and it's most susceptible among the diseases to leaf spot. You see a 25 there where it's very good against spotted wilt and pretty good against white mold as well. So with this variety, what we want to do is plant in single rows because it does have large vines, if that's an option. If you're planting in twin rows, that's okay. Just make sure you're not overseeding those in twin rows. Like as you see here, because it has good germ and we don't need to plant that many seeds to get a good stand with this variety. Also, the major thing is controlling leaf spot. Again, that's the variety's biggest weakness in terms of disease, so you want to focus on that just like we focused on white mold for Georgia 6G and spotted wilt for 331. We're going to focus on leaf spot for this particular variety because that's its biggest weakness. So again, don't plant too many seeds because it has good germ. Don't over fertilize or over water because it has excellent vine growth without any of those things to encourage vine growth. And the bottom line for this variety, for Tough Runner 297, is to manage to minimize leaf spot, especially under irrigation. And that means a good fungicide program and a good rotational program. And manage to control vine growth. And the last variety we'll look at is Georgia 12Y. It's a relatively new variety, not a lot of acres grown of it, but it is out there. And it has quite large vines like the Flowrun 331 and 297. Very good disease package as you see here compared to all the other varieties, but it is late in maturity, so we need to take that into account as well. So if you look at those two things, late maturity and vine growth, what do we do with this variety? Well, planting in single rows would be helpful. It's not necessary. You can plant twin rows, but you would certainly want to minimize the vine growth in those kind of situations. And if you're in those situations, it probably would be a good idea to look at apogee and less fertility compared to what you were growing other peanut varieties that have less vine width. One big factor to consider is the maturity. If you're planting this variety, you certainly don't want to plant it in late May unless you're sure that you're in an area where you have enough growing degree days. You want to plant that variety a little earlier, and that's okay since it has good disease tolerance, especially to spotted wilt, to maximize its maturity window. So it's going to be another 10 days to 2 weeks later than the other varieties that we just looked at. So in terms of controlling the vine growth, not planting too many seeds again, not over fertilizing, and not planting in twin rows would be important to minimize the vine growth. So the bottom line for Georgia 12Y is plant early up to mid-May, not late May, to maximize the maturity that you're going to achieve at the end of the season and manage to control vine growth. Just to summarize, it's clear that each variety is a little different in what it needs to maximize its performance, as we saw with just those 4 varieties. So it's important to know what those characteristics are, and if you'd like to see them in person, we are hopeful to have our field day in 2021 on August 19th in Marianna, Florida, and look forward to seeing you there.